Hello everyone, welcome back. I thought on quite a rainy day such as today, I would go through my collection of Vladimir Sorokin books. This would be very similar to how I went through them with my Richard Brautigan collection, and so I'm going to go through talking about which ones I've read, which are the vast majority of these. I have the vast majority of what is available currently in English on hand, and I'll talk about the ones I don't, as well as what my experience was reading them. I think what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them, what I think other people might enjoy in terms of where you might want to start if you're looking to start, or if you're looking for something new in his bibliography, just what I find to be interesting. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. Like I said, I have a vast majority of them here. So as you might notice, I do not have There for Hearts, which came out a couple years ago through Dalkey. I have yet to see that in person anywhere. I try not to buy these too much online, although I will say a lot of them have ended up being online sales via, something like the NYRB sales, stuff like that. But I try to find them out in the open. I like to support the local bookstores and whatnot, and I have yet to ever see There for Hearts in person. So eventually I will order that, but I've got, a long list of what I've read and I've collected currently. Out of these, there are only two I have not read. You would be very surprised, if you're someone who is aware of Vladimir Sorokin and the fact that I've read the vast majority of these, that I have not read Blue Lard. I think when I recorded my video on Red Pyramid, which maybe some of you are here from, I had said, I had just got both of these in the mail, and I was so excited for Blue Lard. I'd been, hyping it up, or had it hyped up for me for years, and then I decided to go read Red Pyramid instead. Still have yet to get to this, and it's been over a year. So, and I think some of that is the intimidation. I think this really is one I want to save. As someone who's a big fan of Russian literature, of a lot of different books of that kind of part of the world and throughout history, a lot of the 19th century stuff I am pretty novice to. And so because of the nature of this book, where he's replicating a lot of classic Russian authors, their styles, I kind of want to hold off until I'm a little more well-versed in that kind of background. I read a lot of more Soviet stuff, but when it comes to the classics that you would think when you talk about Russian literature, a little bit more novice to. So I'm saving that one. It's been sitting on my shelf for a year, and who knows how long it'll sit after that. Other one I have not read yet. I'm going to have to break up this stack. I stacked it just so that it would look nice, but we got here this very dastardly cover. This one just came out this year, Dispatches from the District Committee. This is another collection of short stories. This is from Dalkey. So you can see, there's the classic Dalkey Spiral Maze. I've only read the introduction from this so far. I'm hoping to, in the next couple months, read this because I love the short stories of Vladimir Sorokin. This one is a collection that goes from the late 70s to about 2018, which is similar to Red Pyramid. So I'm just really excited to get into that. I haven't really bought many modern Dalkey books. I've got a lot of the classic ones from like the 90s and early 2000s, and I'm just impressed by the quality of this. I think that, I think it's Deep Vellum who owns them now. This is really good quality. The paper, the cover, it's all printed really well. I want to get to some of the illustrations, just because I've flipped through this a few times. As you can tell, there's some really nice illustrations that accompany these stories. And so I'm excited to read this. It's just mostly been, I'm reading a lot of different stuff right now for a lot of different projects, my own interest in reading as well as for other videos, and so I've yet to get around to this. I only bought it back in March, I want to say. It only came out in the spring, maybe February. I bought this in LA at, I don't know if I have a bookmark in here, but a bookstore in LA. It was the first time I ever saw it. I'm flipping through now. Do not. Oh, here's the bookmark. Because I do like to try to state where I got these things from. Where is it? Skylight Books in Los Angeles. Got it there. It was only time I've seen it. I think Open Books has gotten it since then when I've looked on their online catalog, but I have yet to see it in person. So I'm excited to get to this. There's a new one coming out, and this is also why I'm trying to do this video now, is before I get even more out of date talking about these books, is there's the new, through Dalkey, Vladimir Sorokin novel, Sugar Kremlin, which is coming out, and that is a sequel, or at least a follow-up of sorts, to The Day of the Oprichnik, which this is one of the earliest examples of Sorokin in English, and I'll get a little bit into that. But yeah, that book it was originally supposed to come out next month. It's going to get pushed back to September, and I kind of want to reread this prior. So I'll start with it there. This is where I started reading Vladimir Sorokin. A couple years ago, I got interested in him due to just looking for a more contemporary, or at least late Soviet period Russian author. And what really intrigued me was just like, this was the name that came up so often. Now, a lot of what came up for Vladimir Sorokin would be more of his post-Soviet period stuff, which is one of what this book is. This is Day of the Oprichnik. This one came out in 2006, translated by Jamie Gabriel. And I'll talk about a little bit about my experiences with the translators too, as there are 3 different translators of Sorokin, at least currently. But this is probably the one you'll see around the most. I got this from Open Books a couple years ago for $7.50. I see this around. If I'm going to see a Sorokin book out in the wild, it's this one. So I think this is a decent place to start. Now, I read this the month before the war in Ukraine started, which was good and bad, because I think your experience and understanding of this book will change a lot more reading it after that has also our current kind of climate of Russia that we're in now. So I read this, like I said, literally a month before the war started. What this is this was written in 2006, but it is a science fiction near future Russia of the 2020s Russia. I think I want to say it's 2027, 2026, so about 20 years in the future from that point onward. And Russia has become kind of an isolated state. They've gone back to a more Russian Empire feudalist system. If you know anything about the Oprichniks, they were kind of a part of the Russian Empire and this kind of like secret guard of sorts that would protect, royalty. And so that's kind of playing into who are the leaders of Russia now and what goes on with that. So they play a little bit more like a secret agent kind of role, secret service role, I should say. And there's this very kind of occult, fratinistic group, the Oprichniks, and they're very brutal, and this is literally just following them for a day. So I think this is a very fast read. I read this in a weekend, a couple days, and it is around less than 200 pages. There's some moments in here that feel very much like a Philip K. Dick book. Like I said, it's very fast-paced. It's a lot of the weird and kind of disgusting nature of a Sorokin novel, where it kind of flips it on its head. There were some really interesting components to this. The fact that Russia becomes kind of its insular society in a similar way that it kind of is today, due to the outside world pushing it away, and of course the actions done by Russia. The sun's coming out now. This is going to be very different from the beginning by the end. Really, like. It parallels a lot with current society. There's something in here where they have the cars that they drive are the Mercedes, because Russia's back to producing its own cars, not importing anything from the West or from the outside world, in a similar way to how kind of things happened immediately after tariffs and sanctions were put on Russia. Just like, it feels very predictive. If you're looking for something that is for the present day and kind of commenting on Russia, I think this is a great place to start. So like I said, I want to go back to it because this is my first one I read, and it was great. Then, although I don't know, I was kind of a little lost by it. I don't think I fully appreciated it, and I think that reading it, just even a month later, I would have taken a completely different view on it. A couple months later, and I had already owned this by this point, but I didn't want to read it because it's such a big one, is the Ice Trilogy, also translated by Jamie Gramble. And this is 3 novels in one. This was also written in the 2000s, I think 2002 to 2006, so similar time period. And as you can tell, it feels very extraterrestrial. This is a trilogy of books. I want to say the names of them are, if I can find a little introductory status of it. They are Bro, Ice, and 23,000. Now, originally, Ice was the first book written, and the prequel came after. And so, in a sense, that is the prequel. And they're just kind of bundled like this for the English readers. You need that context of the first book. I can't imagine reading the second one without it, and just kind of diving in. But also, there's a lot of setup, and it's a very different book from the rest of the books. A lot of people like to talk about Vladimir Sorokin and compare him to maybe a Thomas Pynchon, and I really never felt that way for most of my reading of Vladimir Sorokin. Maybe it was because I was a little too novice in either of these authors. What I would compare, and I haven't read it yet, is Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon, how it's a large book kind of taking on a bunch of different genres. That's kind of what this does. The Vladimir Sorokin here in the first book, Bro, he is writing kind of like talking through Russian history. It starts in kind of that late Russian Empire period, and it works its way up until about maybe 1950 in the first book. And then the second book kind of skips immediately to present day of the 2000s, and it stays a little bit more around there, but it skips around a little bit more. While it's moving through the time periods, you have like this Russian Empire period that feels very much like a classic Russian lit, a Tolstoy, Dostoevsky kind of whatever thing, where it's just classic Russian Empire setting and tone. And then once the Soviet period starts, it takes on a socialist realism kind of narrative. And from there, it kind of moves on and on and on. And when you're in the present day, it feels a little bit more like a spy thriller, like almost like a James Bond kind of book. There's a couple other moments, it's very science fiction-y at points. There's almost like a prison break narrative at one point. It has a lot to it, and I think it's really impressive, and I think this is a very underrated book when it comes to the works of Vladimir Sorokin. I think, honestly, out of all of them I've read, of the novels, this might be my favorite. Now, I will say that, some points were really high and some were really low, so it kind of evened out to being kind of just a whatever read for me. It was also the second book I read from him, and I do want to go back and reread this. I think these two really are the two that I want to reread the most. But I can't recommend this enough. It came out in 2011 through NYRB, and it is not easy to find now. I found this copy, and honestly, like the spine is like, the glue is coming out. I bought this for $10, and it was like already falling apart, so I need to re-glue it. I need to figure out how to fix this. I need to reread it. So that's kind of where I'm at with that one. Now, the third book I read, and that was because it had just come out at the time, I got to dig through all these, was Telluria. Now, Telluria is a book that originally came out in Russian in 2013. Wow, this really blends in with the carpet. Really blends in with the carpet. This is every single book by Vladimir Sorokin is different, and that's kind of what I want to get into. Is that just because a book works for me doesn't necessarily mean it works for you, and vice versa. A lot of people have enjoyed Telluria. This honestly was the first one I really didn't enjoy, but I do want to go back to it. As any great author, any author I really like, it deserves a rereading. And this is the first one I read by Max Lawton translation, and I really was not into it at the time. This is a book that is, I think, about 50 vignettes. Each chapter is a different little vignette, never maxing out more than 10 pages. And it tells the same story of this world of Telluria. So this is a future Russia, future world, where kind of the whole of the globe is more feudalized, fractured into different states. And I'm trying to remember a lot of it because it really has been a couple years since I've read it, but I ultimately don't really enjoy that kind of storytelling method. I think that it's a little hard to get into. I enjoy different vignettes more than others, and ultimately I just didn't attach myself too much to it. I will also say this is the first time that I really felt like there was some deja vu in the writing of Sorokin. So Telluria here, he's got a lot of these like kind of mystery substances or alien kind of fantastical elements in his stories, and they really tread the same ground. And I think maybe it's just because I read Ice Trilogy first, but I think it was done best here because it's so long, because it got to be explored in so many different ways. But I really think it's just treading the same ground in all these stories. So to go back to Ice Trilogy for a quick second, ice is this property that it's quite literally like it's a meteor that lands on Earth in Siberia in the 1920s. And this expedition team goes out to get it. Throughout the whole narrative, there's kind of this like occult following that's built around it, and you find out that there's some beings who are the true beings and some are just kind of vessels. And I don't really want to spoil too much, but like what they do is they kind of hammer this ice into the person, and if they're a true being, they kind of are enlightened by it, and they join in with this rest of this occult group, and they've just existed for decades and decades and decades ever since. And it's a really interesting substance that kind of, I don't know, it's a really interesting concept. It's very sci-fi. It is done in an interesting way, but you see a similar idea between ice and Telluria, which is the kind of the magical wonder substance here. And I just felt like it was told so much better here. Now, of course, they're distinctly different, but they touch on a lot of the same concepts. And that's not even the last book where he really does this. So we'll keep talking about it. Next I read, and I think it was the fourth I read that year, was The Q. And I really liked The Q. This actually, if I had to really think about like a novel that I liked, is probably my favorite. And this one is translated. It's a different translator. I don't know why it doesn't say it on the cover. Sally Lard. And they are a British translator, and I know that because, one, it says The Q. It also has a lot of different British isms in it, which, as an American reader, is distracting to me, and I'm sure vice versa if you are a British reader, or at least learn English through a British speaker in the same way. But I just felt like this was a little distracting. That was my only criticism, really. I really enjoy this. This is from 1981, I want to say, early 80s. So it is during the Soviet period, so you can tell by the cover. And it is a commentary on the Soviet system. It's very different from all these other ones, not very sci-fi at all. What goes on in this is you really just get it's almost like a radio transcript. So as you see there's no real descriptors or anything like that. I describe this as, imagine you have a backpack with a tape recorder in it, and you're listening back to that tape recorder sometime in the future with zero context of who recorded this, who was there, any of that kind of stuff. You're just overhearing what's going on. You're hearing dialogue, you're hearing sounds from the streets, kind of stuff like that. And that's a really cool, interesting way to tell a story. So you might not enjoy that, but I really enjoy it. So I don't know if this is necessarily a good starting point, if that sounds interesting to you. I always, when I got into Vladimir Sorokin, I wanted to read a book from his Soviet period. I wanted to read that more than anything else. So when I finally got this and I was finally reading it, I just was really, that's what I was looking for. And it has a really great commentary on, the late Soviet period when people were going after the sought-after, far-away imported goods, having to wait in long, arduous lines. And there's a whole afterword by the author, as is mentioned on the cover, where he kind of talks about that, how, the Soviet Union, lines were such a unique creation. And honestly, I see where he's coming from, but I also see that in capitalist societies, we have arduous manufactured lines. You think about, going to an amusement park, going to Disneyland, that's all lines, and it's all manufactured lines. And the fact that you can pay to skip the line. Going to the Supreme store, that's a line. You think about, I don't know, just there's a lot. Manufactured lines exist in all sorts of economic systems. So it was interesting to read it here, but also compare it to the hyper-capitalist society of today. Overall, I really like this one, but I honestly, of all the other ones, I do want to read the ones I didn't like as much, again, more than I would this one. So that is from that. Next up, if you are a longtime follower of the channel, you remember I read from this collection. This is Red Pyramid. It just came out last year from NYRB, also translated by Max Lawton. And this is probably my favorite thing I've read from him, from Vladimir Sorokin. I really love that cover. I really love this collection. It is a collection that I think starts in 1981 and goes up till 2017, 2016, 2018, late 2010s. So you think about it, the Russian society, there's a lot of people who've lived through that entire period, and how much has changed in that time period and how much has changed since that period. All his stories, while not necessarily being about Russian society, are, to a degree, Russian society commentary. So, stuff early on will be a lot more Soviet discussions, and then stuff more later on, you get more of an optimism maybe with a post-Soviet world, at least in the early 2000s, and then seeing how kind of things have progressed into the 2010s, you see more of a dismal disconnect in ways. You get those comments, but also they're just really interesting and creative stories. Now, once again, like I mentioned, he's a very boundary-pushing author in terms of what content is in these books and what is kind of digested by the readers, accepted by the readers. And, just because I enjoy reading these books doesn't mean necessarily that I enjoy what he's put in them. I think it's more of the visceral reaction that I think is most interesting. And a lot of these stories, at least early on, and if you watch my Red Pyramid video where I read from Obelisk, which is an early story. I think it's the first or second story in this collection. It really talks about this. He would make these really traditional Socialist Realism stories, very run-of-the-mill about everyday Russian life. Like I think in Obelisk, he's literally like, it's a woman and his daughter, and her daughter, going to a roadside cemetery for, I believe, her husband or father or some family member who had died in the war, and going there, and then it just kind of turns, and it turns into this really disgusting, crass, irreverent narrative. Just kind of, and he does that a lot in a lot of these collections. But what happens is, that would get old, but he expands and grows as an author, and you really get to see that growth in this collection. That's why I really think it's one of his best. If I had to choose a starting place, I do like this. Now I will admit that, short story collections, maybe that's not your thing. Maybe this content isn't for you, but I think it's an easy way to learn then that it's not for you, as opposed to trying to dive deep into something like a Blue Lard or whatever, where you have to know a lot of background or dedicate a lot of time. This was my favorite thing I read last year, which is, high praise, because it rarely is that a short story collection is something that I praise that highly and enjoy that much. Because, there's good and bad stories, and I'll admit that there were stories I liked in here better than others, but there were... overall, it was just kind of like, I love reading a short story collection that goes through an author's entire career. Something where you really get like them at the beginning and then them as they grow and progress as an author. Other stories I enjoyed in here, and if you watch my favorite videos of 2024 video, I talk about this a little bit more because it was a little fresher in my mind. Where is a context? It's not easy to do these videos one-handed. I remember from last time. And last time it was cold winter, and now it's humid, hot summer, especially now that the rain stopped. Where is it? I don't know. I don't know where the table of contents is, but there's a couple stories in here I really love. There was one that's just talking about like kind of it feels like a very Kafkaesque story, but in a more contemporary. It's from the early 2000s. Here we go. Which one was it? Maybe Nastya or Horse Soup. I forget exactly the title that went along with it. But it just describes these conditions of eating and the disgust of food, and someone with similar health problems to me. It felt very applicable to that. Some of the later stories too feel much more postmodern, where he starts with one concept and by the end of the story is a completely different story. And I think that is just really impressive that he can do that in a short story context. And I never really read too much. I don't know. I guess I don't really read a lot of short story collections from postmodern authors. But beyond the whole like commentary on Russian society, I thought that was really impressive too. And that's what makes this such a good collection. So this year, earlier, I finally got my hands. I think this was last year. I actually got my hands on it, but I read it this year. Is The Blizzard by Vladimir Sorokin, and this is also translated by Jamie Gambrell. Probably pronounced it 3 different times this entire video. And this is a book that came out originally in Russia in 2010 and came out in English in 2015. And this feels very 2010. It is kind of like a zombie apocalypse novel. It is, I think, 150 pages. There's no chapter breaks. And this is my least favorite of anything I've read of his. Now, that's not to say, I know a lot of people who love this book, so I don't want to dissuade you from reading this. I think it's mostly because I'm less familiar with a lot of the 19th century Russian authors and writing styles. But it feels very steampunk at times. It's a zombie apocalypse. You're out in the snow, so you have these 2 characters who are taking a sled, and they're bringing a vaccine essentially across the snow tundra. And they're trying to get it to whatever location they're going to save humanity. And it's kind of just bleak and dark. And there's a moment in the middle that I really enjoy where it's kind of a dream sequence that feels very in line with a lot of the classic Sorokin extremeness, where the character's getting boiled alive. And that feels very much in line with classic Sorokin, and I enjoyed that. Just reading the visceral nature of that. But everything else was it was boring to me. I did not enjoy this. I felt like one of the things I didn't like about the translation is it kept using the term damnation, which this is something, if I were to compare between this and Max Lawton translations, a lot of people don't, I don't know. I wouldn't say a lot of people. I've heard criticisms of Max Lawton's translations, and it's fair if you don't like it or not, but I think he captures the irreverence really well, and that visceralness, and just like, especially for a modern tone. But like using damnation in a Vladimir Sorokin novel, it just felt weird, because it's like, I don't think in the dire situation of like, I'm freezing to death, and you're just like, I don't think that translates. I don't know what the original Russian was, but I bet you it was not something as like eloquent as like just saying damnation. I think it was a little bit more crude and crass and extreme. That's all I'm going to say. I felt like that was distracting to me. Whereas something in here, or where it's gross and whatever, sure, it's not like, enjoyable, but it feels more realistic. It feels more vivid. It feels more to the nature of like going through a horrific, bizarre scenario. You're going to be speaking in a better, more interesting way. So if there was a book out of these that I wouldn't hold on to, it probably would be Blizzard. I don't need a hard copy of this. I got this from Open Books too for probably $8, which is not bad. But it's hard to see. I don't find this one around a lot, considering it's an older one. For the longest time, Day of the Oprichnik, the Blizzard, and Ice were the only three. I guess Q was around too. But out of that like classic selection, if I can pull out the too many covers, right? Q, Ice, Day of the Oprichnik, Blizzard were the only ones around up until the last couple years. This is kind of where it stands with Vladimir Sorokin for me right now. I'm excited for Sugar Kremlin, especially because I enjoyed Day of the Oprichnik, and it gives me an excuse to go back to it. And I think that's just a really interesting concept, like the bringing the past of Russia into the future. Now, of course, I didn't really like get all of it because I'm not like super well versed in Russian culture like that. That's kind of the point too, I should mention before I end this and sign it off, is that your understanding of Russian culture, literature, history really benefits your enjoyment of these books. If you're someone who doesn't know anything about this, I would probably avoid Vladimir Sorokin, at least generally. I think they're books you can enjoy. So like I said, like I think if you've read a lot of like the classic Tolstoy kind of stuff, you'll enjoy this more, at least than I did. But there's not really much in terms of Russian culture and history and whatever else. Aside from that, just kind of like the style and whatnot. You really need to know a lot about Soviet society, especially late Soviet society, to really enjoy the Q. But you don't have to be like a PhD student in it for any of these really. It just maybe you'll get a little bit more out of it. Red Pyramid, definitely need to know Russian history and stuff like that, but it also is very interesting literarily, where I think that is worth exploring and checking out. Telluria, there is components, but I don't know if that's really as much of a focus as some of these other ones. I think just world history in general, like it's a lot more global of a novel, and similarly, Ice Trilogy is a global novel in itself as well, but there's a lot more focus on Russia. I think this is probably my best example if you want to read science fiction from a modern Russian, like post-Soviet lens. This really is the one to check out, and I think this is the most underrated of any of his works that I've read, so I really can't recommend it enough. But I will say that some parts I enjoyed much more than others, so I don't think it's like, by far like an amazing, perfect, like just completely like overlooked classic by any means. And then Day of the Oprichniks, there definitely was a lot, like I said, that is history-based and culture-based, understanding that, and just getting closer to the date in which this book takes place. It feels very in line with like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, just kind of, it's not like in that same tone, but like the fact that we are coming up on a time period that this was written decades prior, and it feels very predictive and prophetic in ways. So I hope this video is a little informative, and I'm hoping to check back in when I've read more and when more is available in English. I know that there will be only more and more coming out, so that's why I don't want to push off this video forever, where, if I can speak on these things in a more relevant and interesting way, I can do it. And I hope you have a good day. I'm glad that the sun came back out, although it is now very hot. Have a good one. Bye.